Welcome to Religion Story YouTube channel. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you. His name was Jonathan Miller, an investigative journalist for a prestigious newspaper. At 38, John was known for his skepticism toward religion and any form of faith. Raised in an Anglican Christian family, he had dismissed religion as outdated folklore by his 20s. His career was built on sharp logic and a passion for uncovering facts, not myths. One day, the editorial team assigned him a special feature titled The Face of Islam in Europe, amidst rising interfaith tensions and growing stereotypes about Muslim communities. The goal was to explore the human side of a community often misunderstood. One of the key interviewees recommended to him was Imam Abdul Rahman, an elderly scholar living in a suburban area. The mosque where he served wasn't grand, its structure was modest, the walls worn, and the carpet faded. Yet what made the place special was its peaceful atmosphere. John didn't expect much. He assumed he'd meet a conservative man spouting religious slogans and dogma. But when he arrived, he was greeted by a man over 70, with a white beard, a sincere smile, and a calming gaze. "Welcome, Mr. Jonathan," said Imam Abdul Rahman. "Please have a seat. I don't have the kind of coffee you usually drink, but our tea holds its own blessings." The interview began routinely. Jonathan asked about Islam's views on tolerance, extremism, and the role of religion in the modern world. But instead of answering with quotations or rhetoric, the Imam responded with stories about people, suffering, love, and forgiveness. "Religion isn't about who is the most right, John," he said at one point. "It's about who is most sincere in seeking the truth. And sometimes, God hides his light in the darkest places." Slowly, the interview turned into a heart-to-heart conversation. John began to open up about losing his father as a child, about his doubts in God, and about the loneliness behind his success. Imam Abdul Rahman simply listened. No judgment. No pressure. Then, before John left, the Imam said, "If you want to understand Islam, don't just look at its followers. Read the Quran as if it were a letter from someone who loves you deeply." John took home the interview recording, but he also carried a restlessness he had never felt before. Night after night, he read the Quran in translation. He tried to analyze it with logic, but behind the verses he felt something he couldn't explain, a trembling of the soul. He visited the Imam several more times, now not as a journalist, but as a seeker. He witnessed the life of a humble yet loving Muslim community. He was moved by how Islam regulated all aspects of life not through force, but with purpose. One night, after a long discussion, Imam Abdul Rahman gently asked, "Do you feel your heart is ready to surrender to the Almighty?" John looked up at the night sky from the mosque's courtyard. The stars shone brightly, and for the first time in his life, he felt peace. A few weeks later, in the stillness of that same prayer room, Jonathan recited the Shahada before Imam Abdul Rahman and a few witnesses. His name was now Yusuf Miller. Tears streamed down his face, not from sorrow, but from liberation. He felt like he had come home after being lost in the desert for far too long. Yusuf now lives with a new mission. He remains a journalist, but he is more than that. He is a bridge between a world that often misunderstands Islam and the truth he has discovered. He authored a book titled In the Light of Submission, which became a bestseller in many countries. Imam Abdul Rahman passed away a few years later, but his legacy lives on in Yusuf's heart and in many others. At the end of his book, Yusuf writes, "I interviewed an Imam in search of a story, but I ended up finding myself. Truth is not just something to be believed, it must be lived." After embracing Islam, Yusuf Miller felt a peace he had never known before, but that peace did not come without a price. The early days of his conversion were filled with trials, both internal and external. His family was the first to react with confusion and disappointment. His mother refused to answer his calls for weeks. His brother, a young pastor, sent him a long email filled with Bible verses and rhetorical questions attacking his decision. At work, some colleagues looked at him with suspicion. He now wore a short beard and was occasionally seen performing ablution in the office restroom. He declined to attend office parties that involved alcohol. Subtly but surely, he began to feel isolated. But none of that could shake his faith. True faith is not about comfort, Yusuf wrote one night in his journal, but about the courage to live honestly with your own conscience. His nights were now filled with prayer not as a ritual, but as a deep inner dialogue. In prostration, he felt closest to God. Each verse of the Quran he read in translation took on new meaning. Slowly, he began learning Arabic to understand the divine words without a mediator. One night, forever etched in his memory, he awoke for the tahajjud prayer. His home was silent. The world was asleep. But Yusuf stood facing the Qibla, reciting softly. Indeed, in the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the alternation of the night and the day are signs for those of understanding. He cried. Not out of sorrow, but because he felt small before his greatness, and because he had ignored that call for so long. It took months before his mother was finally willing to meet. They reunited in the family home filled with childhood memories. She looked at him intently, as if searching for traces of the son she once knew. I don't recognize you anymore, she whispered. I'm still Jonathan in your eyes, Mom, Yusuf replied gently. But now I'm more honest about who I am and what I believe in. Surprisingly, it wasn't a theological argument or scriptural quotation that softened his mother, it was Yusuf's changed behavior. He became more patient, gentle, and attentive. He visited her more often, helped her in the kitchen, and listened to her old stories without rushing. Slowly, the icy wall began to melt. One day, she quietly asked, "If you're happy, is your God the same as mine?" Yusuf simply smiled and answered. He is the God of all people, Mom. The one who never closes his door to anyone who knocks. In the years that followed, Yusuf continued writing but with renewed purpose. He no longer just uncovered stories, he wrote with a mission, to speak the truth, touch hearts, and shine light into the dark corners of public understanding about Islam. He visited prisons, gave talks at rehabilitation centers, and shared his journey with young people. He didn't preach with pressure, but with honesty, humility, and example. People began to know him not just as a journalist, but as a bridge between worlds. A calm voice rising from the depths of spiritual experience. I did not become a Muslim because I hated my previous faith, or because of an identity crisis. I became a Muslim because I found a love greater, deeper, and purer than I ever imagined. And that love called to me patiently, through the gentle voice of an old Imam in the mosque corridor. Yusuf Miller, from his book Letters from My Soul. A few years after embracing Islam, Yusuf felt a strong urge to deepen his knowledge directly in Muslim lands. He took a leave of absence from his job and traveled to several countries in the East, not as a tourist, but as a seeker of knowledge. In a simple Pesantren, Islamic boarding school, located at the foot of a mountain, he studied fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence, tafsir, Quranic exegesis, and akhlaq, ethics. There, he stayed in a small bamboo-walled room, woke up before dawn, and ate with the students, most of whom were much younger than him. One of his teachers, a scholar in his 50s, said to him, "Knowledge is not just in the head, Yusuf. It must reside in the heart and be reflected in actions." From that, Yusuf learned that Islam is not just about memorization and theory, but about how we live and treat others. He then visited historical Islamic sites, old mosques, ancient madrasas, and the graves of scholars. In every place, he found one common thing, a serene submission. At a seminar in a large city, Yusuf met a brilliant young woman named Amina. She was a graduate of an overseas university who returned to her home country to dedicate herself to education. Their initial conversation was light, touching on literacy and digital dawah, Islamic outreach. However, Yusuf was impressed by her deep thinking, her firm principles, and the gentleness with which she expressed her views. A few months later, after going through the process of ta'aruf, introducing oneself with the intention of marriage, and consultation with Amina's family, Yusuf proposed. They had a simple wedding, attended only by close family and friends. In his prayer that night, Yusuf whispered, "O Allah, you brought me from darkness to light, and now you have granted me a companion in this journey. Do not let me turn away from you." Back in his homeland, Yusuf and Amina founded a modern Islamic literacy institute. They published books, held workshops, and opened an interfaith dialogue forum that was inclusive and peaceful. Yusuf didn't speak with a loud voice or force. He wrote, told stories, and engaged in dialogue. He knew that the human heart cannot be grasped by logic alone, it must be touched with gentleness and sincerity. He wrote a weekly column titled From the Mosque Corridor, which was read by thousands, both Muslims and non-Muslims. One of his most viral writings was, "I was never forced into Islam. I was embraced by it." A few years later, Yusuf faced his greatest trial. Imam Abdul Rahman, the teacher who had once guided him to the light, fell seriously ill. Yusuf traveled a long distance to visit him. In his bed, the Imam smiled weakly. "Yusuf," he said softly, "you came from far, but our hearts are now close." "Imam," said Yusuf, holding back tears, "all of this started because of you." The Imam only shook his head, "Not from me. The light was always in you. I just knocked on the door. It was God who opened it." A few days later, Imam Abdul Rahman passed away. Yusuf cried for a long time in his prostration that night. But he knew, his mission was not over. The path was still long. Time passed. Yusuf and Amina were blessed with 2 children, a son and a daughter. They were raised in a home filled with love, knowledge, and good manners. Yusuf often read them stories of the prophets and their companions before bed. One night, his son asked innocently, "Dad, you weren't Muslim before, were you?" Yusuf smiled and nodded. "That's right. Why did you become a Muslim?" Yusuf hugged his son tightly. "Because I found my home. Not a home made of stone and wood, but a home for my soul. Islam is not just a religion. It is the path home. And for anyone who seeks, the door is always open." A few years after the passing of Imam Abdul Rahman, Yusuf felt a significant shift in his life. He felt closer to his purpose to bridge the misunderstandings about Islam, both in the West and the East. The books he wrote and the lectures he gave gained more followers, both Muslims and those wanting to learn more about Islam from the perspective of a former Christian. One day, he was invited to speak at an international forum attended by religious leaders from all over the world. Standing before them, Yusuf spoke calmly and confidently. "True religion does not belong to a specific group, but to every soul seeking truth and peace. I'm not just speaking about Islam, I'm speaking about humanity. Islam taught me to seek truth through compassion, not violence. I want people to know that it is not religion that causes hatred, but ignorance that prevents us from seeing the true light." His statement moved many. Those who had been skeptical of Islam began to view it in a different light. People from various backgrounds, whether Christian, Jewish, or even agnostic, approached Yusuf to inquire further about his spiritual journey. Over time, Yusuf came to understand that spiritual journeys are not straight paths easily explained. He spent much time reflecting, writing, and praying in solitude. Now, after many years as a Muslim, he felt that this quest for truth was an ongoing process. One quiet night, as he sat in his study, with the Quran in his hand and his eyes slightly weary, he wrote in his personal journal, "I've traveled many roads, and found many answers. Yet I know one thing, truth is not something that can be possessed by one person, one nation, or one religion. It belongs to those who sincerely seek it, those who remain humble, and those who keep their hearts pure, even as the world outside is full of confusion." Yusuf began to think about the end of his life. He felt he was on the right path, but also became increasingly aware that life is temporary. As Imam Abdul Rahman once taught him, death is not the end, but the beginning of a longer journey. And every good deed we do will continue as reward, even after we are gone. Yusuf and Amina decided to settle in a peaceful small town. They opened an Islamic educational center that emphasized tolerance, peace, and interfaith understanding. The place became a hub for many who wished to learn about Islam in a loving and respectful manner. One morning, as Yusuf walked around his house surrounded by lush trees, he reflected on the legacy he wanted to leave behind. Perhaps he wouldn't be known by many, but he wanted every person who ever crossed his path to remember one thing: the light of truth illuminated with love and sincerity. He often told his students, "Be a light in this world. Do not let hatred and ignorance cloud the light within your heart." Islam teaches us to be a source of peace, wherever we are. As time passed, Yusuf grew more content in his old age with wisdom. He often sat with Amina on their porch, sipping tea, and reminiscing about the long journey they had taken together. They spoke of their children, who were now adults and independent, and their hopes for a better world. That night, Yusuf wrote a letter to himself, a letter revealing his reflections on life. "If there is one thing I want to pass on to my grandchildren, it is sincerity in seeking the truth. Truth that comes from a sincere heart, always open to learning and loving, even though the world often teaches the opposite. Islam has taught me that this life is a journey toward God, and that journey is about sincerity in every step." A few years later, at the age of 85, Yusuf peacefully passed away. As he had always believed, death was not the end but a step toward an eternal life. Surrounding him were Amina, their children, and friends, all accompanying his departure with prayers and peace. After Yusuf's death, the legacy he left behind continued to live on. His books, his lectures, and the educational center he founded continued to inspire many. His life story became an example of how one can find peace through a spiritual journey filled with searching, doubts, and ultimately submission. One day, a young man visited the educational center founded by Yusuf. He sat in a quiet corner, opened one of Yusuf's books, and read, "The light is within our hearts. Only by opening our hearts can we see this world in its true light." The young man closed the book, and without hesitation, stepped outside. He knew, his journey had just begun, the journey to find the true light.